must say to you, I am really grateful that you have allowed us the opportunity to come and share with you this afternoon our thoughts on a great lady, Mrs. Rosa Parks, and of course to share with you some of the things that we're doing in Detroit and that I am involved in. There is a card going around that I've asked you to please sign. It is a birthday card for Mrs. Parks because, as many of you may know, today is her birthday. She was born in 1913, and we are so blessed to have had her live with us in our times. So if you'll please sign that card. She is away in California for the winter. She will return to Detroit in the spring, and we will give her that card from Focus Hope and from her friends here in Iowa. How many of you are familiar with the life and works of Mrs. Rosa Parks? Very good. So, we don't have very many to tell a few things about Mrs. Parks today because you already know. I bring you greetings also from the great state of Michigan and the city of Detroit, which is the home of Mrs. Rosa Parks. And she came to make that her home in 1957 after having refused to give up her seat on that bus in 1955. They made her life very uncomfortable in Montgomery. She was unable to get a job. She and her family was constantly harassed. Her husband had to sleep with a gun under his head at night. So they decided that the best thing to do was to join her brother, who had moved to Detroit. And she came to Detroit, they came to Detroit and made their home there. And of course, Mrs. Parks continued to do her work in the area of civil and human rights. So with her new home, she felt that she didn't have to stop doing what she was doing. She simply had to keep on doing that because she knew that what she had done in Montgomery was the right thing to do, and certainly nobody could stop her from doing the right thing. She made it her life work to direct people and guide people on love and respect for all people, no matter who they were. She lectured on many college campuses. She was sought after by many civic and human and civil rights organizations to speak. She took a job in 1987 with, I think she started that job, must have been earlier than 87, but anyway, she took a job with Congressman John Conyers, who is congressman for one of the largest congressional districts in the state of Michigan. And she worked there until 1988. She retired in 1988. And since that time, Mrs. Parks has developed a center. It's called the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development. It is an institute that works with young people. And what it does, what the center does is offer opportunities to groups of ethnically diverse young people from the north to the south to research the civil rights movement and follow the route of the freedom riders from the 1960s experience. The youngsters also cover the Underground Railroad, the migration patterns of African Americans from the south to the north, and the Montgomery bus boycott. The youth also have an opportunity to meet and interact with some of the historical figures who have changed American society. Then there is Pathways for Educators, where educators are also able to use this information and to work it into their classroom activities so that these activities will actually become a part of their curriculum. And then there's the Adopt a School program. And this is a program where volunteer groups pair with local schools to provide support in the form of field trips to historical sites, tutorials, and other auxiliary services. In addition to academic and cultural enrichment activities, This program emphasizes mentoring for children who do not ordinarily have hands-on activities with individual adults. Mrs. Parks is an active part of the Detroit community. The center that she founded is operated by her friend and her traveling companion, who is Elaine Steele. She is the director of that center. And they're very busy. They keep that center very active. They are responsible for fundraising to keep the center open, volunteer recruitment, training, and organizing activity. The Institute is funded through contributions from businesses, corporations, colleges, churches, and civic groups. They have never written a proposal for funding for large grants and that kind of money. They simply operate on small donations that is given to them by these groups. There's still a great demand for Mrs. Rosa Parks' speaking engagement and personal appearances. She has limited those because of her health. In 1993, however, she met with a Japanese university professor who said that he had translated Eyes on the Prize and used it as required viewing. That's history of the civil rights movement from 1955 to its present day time. I think it culminated in 1965 when with the march to Selma, Alabama, from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. And this is required viewing for all school children in Japan. The film was translated into Japanese by Toyota. She's also been invited to Japan in 1994 as a guest of the university. And I say to Mrs. Parks, we thank you very much, Mrs. Parks, for all that you have done for civil and human rights. And we know that you will continue and that the Institute will continue to be a place where young men and women can learn the history of civil and human rights. The other thing I want to do today is to thank some people who have, and particularly some women, who have been active in civil and human rights for many years, but they're little known people. Nobody has bothered to interview them. Nobody has bothered to write a book about them. It may appear to them that what they have done is unimportant, but I want to say to you today, if you had the, I guess I should call this a misfortune, to live in the time of Jim Crow, when Jim Crow was the law. Jim Crow was the law that was practiced in southern states. It was legal to discriminate, to separate anything that had to do with people of color and people who were white. It was the law that you could separate buses, the toilet, the water fountain, restaurants, hotels, any of those areas, any public accommodation. It was legal to do that, and it was okay. But what the law said was it's okay to separate those things as long as they are equal. That meant that you had to have two equal hotels, you had to have equal employment for two, you had to have equal toilets where they both were clean and working at the same time at all times. And that, ladies and gentlemen, never happened. I grew up in a time of Jim Crow. When Mrs. Parks refused to get off the bus in 1955, I was still in high school. I graduated from high school in 1960, and I lived in a small town that at that time may have had 2,500 people in it. And we knew where our place was in that small community. Our mother and father did not allow us to eat in public places because if we ate in public places, we had to take our food out of the restaurant and stand on the corner to eat it. Our mother and father didn't allow us out of the house without a chaperone because we never knew when some child may innocently do something and a white person decided that they didn't like that. And I often remember that we had a sheriff when I was a young girl. We had a sheriff who was responsible for upholding the law in our small town. And our streets were very small, so you walked on one or two sides of the street. And if you didn't walk in the right place on those two sides of the street, about once a month, Mr. Tyson would hit somebody with his nightstick, great big long nightstick like this with a metal inside of it. And he arbitrarily did that constantly to someone. And there was nothing that anybody could do about it. One, there was fear in the community. There was intimidation. And people knew if you complained about it, who were you going to complain to? So our folks were very careful to keep us out of trouble. They was with us constantly. I made sure that there was a responsible person with us who knew what we should not do. Now I told you that because I want to tell you about these pioneering women in this small town where I was raised. I am no longer there, but I talk to them frequently, and I know what's going on in my community. 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education, when the Supreme Court demanded that all schools should be integrated in everywhere, not just the South, but they named several states that had to be monitored closely because they had to integrate those schools because the education was so unequal in those southern states. And it took 15 years for my small hometown, 60 miles outside of Selma, Alabama. It took 15 years to get those schools integrated. And those women that I want to thank today are responsible for that. And I say thank you to Mrs. Hildred Clark, to Jimmy Bryant, Alberta Dixon, Gloria Thompson, Pauline Thompson, Gloria White, Annette Baker, Florida Dickinson, Martha Porter, Rhoda Treadwell, Sammy Turner, Bernice Hudson, and the Draviton Civic Organization, and all of the women who lived in Thomasville, Alabama, Ann Davis, and many others who live there now, and they demonstrate the same characteristics of Mrs. Rosa Parks. They're brave women, they're strong women, they're concerned about others, and these women, a few of these women are school teachers, and I think one's a city council person, but most of these women are housewives, people whose only concern was to see that my child has an equal education and that my child does not have to go through the same thing that I went through when I was a young person. I want my child to be able to have a job that's going to pay them a living wage. I want them to be able to get good health care. I want them to be able to live in the land of the free like everybody else. And these women have to constantly remember that it took 15 years for them to get those schools integrated, and they had to demand that you follow the law. The law said you were supposed to do this, and you didn't do it. Now, we have to demand that right, the same way we had to demand the right to vote. I grew up in Thomasville, Alabama, under Jim Crow. I left there, went to Selma, Alabama to work and go to school. And at that time, by that time, Mrs. Parks had made her move, and the civil rights movement of the history books of today were in its heyday. And we watched in 1962 how the neighborhoods started to have different faces in the neighborhood, and we didn't know who these people were. I worked for a Catholic mission house, and the Catholic organization was the one organization in the community that was responsible for assisting the black community with getting the simple things they needed, like a job, health care. The only place we could go for health care was Good Samaritan Hospital, and that's the only place they would see black folks. They had a mission house along with clothes closet and anything people needed, like recreation for children. We didn't have in the South swimming pools. Our children didn't have swimming pools. They didn't have recreation halls. They didn't have any of those things that we take for granted today where we live. So the Catholic organization had these things for the young people. That was the only place young people could go to have some what we considered supervised, healthy fun, because we were not allowed to go to the Y because the Y was segregated. Young children couldn't do that. So I worked at that mission house, and we were told when these strange people started to come into the city, and Mrs. Amelia Boynton and Marie Foster decided that we have to help these people understand that if you're going to register to vote, it is more than just registering to vote. You have to know what to vote for after you learn to register. After you are able to register to vote, after they let you do that. Well, voting didn't strike me at that time as something that was real seriously important, because the interesting thing was my father had been a registered registered Republican, by the way. He had been a Republican for many, many years down in our little town in Thomasville. It was my father and about 3 or 4 other people who were registered voters in Thomasville, Alabama, and nobody bothered them. You know why nobody bothered them? They were no threat to anybody. First of all, they were expected to listen to the persons they worked for, who was somebody white, who told them who to vote for. First of all, you had to have somebody to vouch for you to get to vote anyway. So my dad had somebody who worked at the state mill to vouch for him to become a registered voter. So it didn't appear to be a real serious problem to me until I started to go to those Dallas County Voters League meetings. And I began to hear Mrs. Boynton talk about, who had been a registered voter for many, many years. She came from Tuskegee and she moved into Selma with her husband and their job. And she kept saying, why aren't you people registered to vote? And people didn't know. People didn't even think about it because it was not something we did. Somebody else was responsible for taking care of us. Those people had taken care of us for years. And they had done things like made sure that we had less than a balanced diet every day, substandard health care, substandard education, and all of us thought that that was okay because we didn't know any better. And people began to tell us better. And the more we listened, the more we understood that we were never going to change unless we got up and did it ourselves. Those people who came from outside were able to come and tell us what was wrong, but they couldn't make the changes because they didn't live there. We lived there and we knew what was going on every day. So we had to do the business of changing. We had mass meetings every single night where somebody came in and motivated us and told us what was happening in other areas of the South, how people were being beat every day if they decided to go to the polls to try to register to vote, where people were losing their jobs every day for that reason, where people were losing their homes every day simply because somebody said, you don't have a right to go down there and vote. What do you want to do that for? We've been taking care of you for years. Why are you interested in doing that? In Mississippi, the voter registration teams from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee would go to the fields where people were working and talk to them about registering to vote. Well, the plantation owner was extremely upset about that because, one, they were stopping people from working, doing whatever they were doing in the fields, and two, he knew that if those people ever decided to rise up and become registered voters and understand what equality was all about, that things were going to change. So
They didn't want that to happen. Well, we got to the point where we had to go downtown to register to vote. We learned that we had to get down there, get in line at the courthouse, and sign up to register to vote. At that time, that was a literacy test for people to register to vote. In Dallas County, they didn't have a poll tax. You didn't have to own property in order to vote in Dallas County, Alabama. There were some states that you had to own property and you had to pay poll tax in order to become a registered voter. In Selma, all they had was about 10 questions on a page that we learned the answer to when we were in 4th and 5th grade, and they would have us come in. First of all, we'd stand in line. We were told by the Catholic Mission House every third Thursday, you are to close down this workplace, and all 45 of you are to go downtown and stand in line at that courthouse until you get registered to vote. Well, we all went obediently downtown, stood in line no matter how cold, how it rained, how hot, because they didn't allow you inside. You couldn't come inside. People were pushed around with cattle prods. They were hit with nightsticks. They were arrested and ticketed for standing in line simply because they knew that you were going to stand there long enough and you were going to eventually get registered to vote. But back to that literacy test. Those questions that were on that test were so simple that, and we figured that the reason they were so simple was because the people who were administering the test probably didn't read higher than 3rd grade reading level. But they gave us that test, and every month when they sent you your statement back, it simply said, you failed to answer one or more questions correctly, therefore you're not a registered voter. Never told you what question you did not answer. Let me tell you, that is the most disappointing feeling in the world, for you to have stood there all that time trying to get registered to vote and you didn't get registered to vote. And let me tell you about me. I got registered to vote in 1965 when I got to Detroit, Michigan. I failed that test 3 times. And I was so upset because I said, gee, I must be a complete idiot. I can't pass that test. Then I discovered that there were doctors and lawyers and school teachers who were going down taking the same test and failing. And they were teaching school every day and teaching children a lot more complicated material than what was on that test. One more form of intimidation and one more form of discrimination. Well, I got to Detroit and decided that, oh, by the way, I want to tell you that I was a part of the 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery. And I was there on Bloody Sunday, Tuesday, when all of the people came from all over the country to support and to march with us to Montgomery. And I was there on the 21st when the group left going to Montgomery. And I don't want you all to think that I'm any martyr or anything, because I'm not. I did not march. I did not march because we were told, and we were told in no uncertain terms, that if you don't think that you can march in this line and not allow somebody to strike you because they may strike you, if you don't think you can avoid talking back to somebody, speaking back to someone when they're talking to you, someone who's standing on the side trying to intimidate you, don't get in this line. This is a nonviolent effort, and that is the only way we can win the right to vote. We cannot win by fighting back, because that doesn't win anything. Well, let me tell you, at that time I was not nonviolent, so I didn't march in anybody's line. I stuffed envelopes, made cheese sandwiches, cleaned up the building, did anything I could, but I could not bring myself to walk out there and allow somebody to hit me, because I probably would have hit back. I would have defeated our purpose, and they probably would have killed me. I mean, I'd have been standing here today. My husband, on the other hand, who used to think fighting on the weekend was what he was supposed to do, that was his recreation. And he was able to march in that, to walk in that march, and understood exactly why we were not to hit back. And I found that very interesting. Here I am, a mild-mannered person. Here he is, an aggressive person. He was able to understand that. Today, I understand very clearly what Dr. King was saying. I know now that had we come out, like in many cases, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had advocated and others had advocated violence for violence. That was not the answer. We couldn't win. Certainly could not win what we were after, which was the right to vote. The right to vote was passed in August of 1965, and we thought we had it made. We had it all wrapped up and sealed in a fine package, and all of us were going to be able to go vote for the people who were going to represent us, and they would control our lives, and everything would be just fine. Well, I have news for you, ladies and gentlemen. I read something the other day that said the civil rights movement was won in 1965 and it's over, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. Well, I beg to differ. The civil rights movement is far from over. It is a lifelong project, and we must be about the business of holding people accountable for not enforcing the law, because that's what that is. That's the law. And a lot of times we have to help people to understand that, because they don't understand it. They think that it's all right to go back to business as usual. And many times, I don't think people do things intentionally sometimes. I think it's that they don't know. And they need someone to help them to understand that. And that's what we are about. All of us have to take responsibility for saying to our brothers and sisters that that's wrong, that's not right. That person is supposed to be able to do anything that you do, and it's all right for them to do it. And you have no right to keep them from that. We have to be about the business of doing that. I work with a civil and human rights organization in Detroit, Michigan. I've been there since 1981. And my mission in life, and I finally found that out when I got to this place where I am now, and I didn't know that in the beginning. I didn't know that when I went there. I have always worked for social programs, and I always believed that I was in an area where I needed to help somebody do something. But when I got to this organization where I am now, the man and woman that's responsible for the founding of Focus Hope, the civil and human rights organization in Detroit, Michigan, those two people have made it their life's work. And we have a mission statement, and I'm going to read it to you because that's what we live by every day. And I'm going to pass these out to you when we finish. But I didn't, because I said I don't like people to read while I try to talk. So here is our mission statement, and I'm going to share that with you. It says, recognizing the dignity and beauty of every person, we pledge intelligent and practical action to overcome racism, poverty, and injustice, and to build a metropolitan community where all people may live in freedom, harmony, trust, and affection, black and white, yellow, brown, and red, from Detroit and its suburbs, of every economic status, national origin, and religious persuasion. We join in this covenant. This statement was adopted in 1968 when the organization was founded. And every single thing that we've done since that time has been based on this mission statement. Every single day we're about the business of helping men and women to balance their lives so that they will be able to take care of their own personal needs. And we have many in a major metropolitan area like Detroit. Every month there are 85,000 people who come to Focus Hope to get commodity supplemental foods. They're government foods, and they come to get that food because they cannot afford to feed their families. Those people have to look for a way to feed their families. The program for pregnant women and young children, and many people ask us, well, what's a civil rights organization doing feeding people? Well, not to have enough food to eat is morally wrong, and it's somebody's responsibility. And we believe that is our responsibility. As people who are concerned about the needs of people in the world, we believe it is seriously our responsibility. So we went about the business of getting food into the state so that we could provide food for pregnant women, so that they could have a healthy baby, for young children up to 6 years old, so that they would become healthy young children, because you know, if you don't feed a baby while the mother is carrying the baby, and you don't feed a child for the first 3 years and they don't get the right nutrients in their diet, they're subject to lose 15% of their brain power. That's according to the United States Department of Agriculture Food and Nutrition section. They lose that and they never gain it back. You can't come back later and say, I'm going to give them enough food to eat now, enough the right kind of food to eat now, because they will be able to redevelop. Won't happen. So we have to do that while that baby is young, so that that child will be able to compete in the education process like those of us who are able to work and have enough of the right kind of food to eat. We have to help that child learn how to read and write and to go through the educational process so that they can go out into the world and get their own job and be able to take care of their own needs. And this, we expect, will eliminate the cycle of poverty. That's why a civil rights organization is feeding women, little children, and old people. We provide food to old people simply because the system changed on old people who had worked very hard to take care of their own needs, put their few pennies in the bank, and then the system changed and the cost of living went up, and those old people had no pensions because they had worked at jobs where nobody paid a pension, nobody took taxes out of their checks, and they didn't have anything to live on. So many of them are living on $400 a month. They have to pay rent. They have to pay for medicine, and some of them have sacks of medicine. They have to pay for transportation to get from one place to the other. So those old people don't have anything to live on. The last thing they think about is food, because they're going to pay their bills. They'll pay their utilities. So we provide food to 30,000 senior citizens every month. Those foods all come from the United States Department of Agriculture through the Farm Bill. It's a part of the food stamp package. And we're required every 4 years to fight with Congress and to fight with the powers that be to see that this food remain in place so that these old people and these little children can have a well-balanced diet. We need volunteers to assist us with doing that. And volunteers are plentiful. Don't ever let anybody tell you that volunteers are not out there. When I tell you that we have 40,000 volunteers who work with us to help see that these programs work, then I'm not exaggerating. They're out there. They don't all work every day of the week, but they certainly come when you need them. They will come and they will pick up the food for old people and take it back to their homes. We have children from schools come in and package the food up in boxes and bring it back and have it ready for somebody to come in and pick up during the week and take it to the old people. How many of you know that you have a supplemental food program here in Iowa, in the state? We visited there yesterday, and those of you that do not know, they have done a remarkable job of putting that program together. They've visited with us in Detroit many times, and they're doing a wonderful job. I noticed that most of the human service needs are located in one area there in Des Moines, and I think that's an excellent thing for people to do, so that, poor people Nobody really think about poor people when they're designing these programs and they're putting things together and all of that. In Detroit, human service agencies are scattered all over the city. And Detroit is a gigantic place. You have to get from one of those places to the other to get those services that are needed. The health department is 5 or 6 miles from where we are, the local food program where those women are referred to get their food every month. The woman is trying to move around with a baby. Then there are certain clinics that are all the way over somewhere else, and then the Department of Social Services located in another area somewhere. So we have to be responsible for helping those people get to where those services are, and we go out and look for volunteers to help us do that. And volunteers come in and say, oh, you mean I can do that? I'm retired. Sure, I can do that. I can help do that. Church groups come in large numbers to help get that kind of stuff done. Those are the kinds of things we can do to get involved and make a difference in somebody's life. We decided back in 1981 that it was not enough just to provide food for people every month and say, here's some food, that could go on for the rest of the person's life, and you still will not have helped them to take care of their own needs. We'd simply be handing them a crumb. So what we've done is design training programs so that men and women could develop a skill and go out into the work world. The most discriminated area in the employment market is the machine tool trade, engineering, and technology. So some people came along and said to our associate director, who's Eleanor Jositis, very dynamic woman who is a civil rights activist and has devoted all of her life to making changes in the lives of other men and women. And they said to them, what can you all do to help us save the tool trade? Because the tool trade was leaving the country, going somewhere else, simply because there were no people left in Michigan who could do those jobs. What they were men who had opened little shops. They had small shops, and they were the shops were closing because the sons and daughters were not interested in the machine tool trade. They didn't think that was important. They were going on with their own lives. So these old gentlemen were having to retire, and there was nobody to take their trade. Now let me tell you why there were no minorities and women, no women in the tool trade, was because if you worked in a plant and you were a minority or a woman, like automobile plants, we're big on automobile plants in Michigan. If you worked in those plants, the only way you got in those special tool rooms was that you went in there to clean up. One man told me during the first interviews that he knew a lot about machinery because when he was sweeping up in the tool room, in the skills room, he would watch people. They didn't know that he watched, but he watched them so that he could learn what they were doing. But you had to have a journey person's card in order to get a job in that trade. They wouldn't let you in. You were excluded. So that's what we've done with the training program. We designed that training program with the assistance, once again, of volunteers, those people who retired from those little factories and said, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm too old. My sons are gone, so I'm closing it up. So those old people came down with the insistence of Father Cunningham, who is our executive director. And they came down and they said, well, I'll help you get this thing started. Some of those people had never been in the inner city. Some of them had never worked with minorities and women, and they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. So during the interview process, we had an interview to bring people into that program, and they were serious interviews that had to do with a lot more than, do you want to learn to do this trade, or how are your math skills, and what about your mechanical skills? We had to ask questions like, and there were 3 persons on the team, 1 person from business and industry who knew the tool trade, 1 person from human resources in a manufacturing area, and 1 person from the civil rights organization, which was Focus Hope. And we asked questions like, have you ever worked with a woman as a supervisor? This was 2 young men. Have you worked with old men who may be white, who may very well call you boy while you're trying to learn this skill? Have you ever worked with a person who need to learn how to live with you? What are you going to do? Do you have an aggressive personality? Because that's not why you're here. You're here to learn this trade so that you can get out of here and get your job and support yourself and your family. So if you think you're going to get up and get all hot under the collar every time somebody forget and call you boy because you think that's a stereotype, sorry, wrong place for you. If you're a woman who think you came in here to look pretty every day with your long earrings and with all your makeup on, and you don't want to get any grease on your fingernails, forget it. You're in the wrong place. You can't be here. Those are the kinds of questions that we had to ask, because if you wanted to get in there, and that was the best place to be, right now those folks make at least $10 an hour when they come out of that training program. That's entry level. And there are plenty of jobs. The newspaper is filled with them every single day. So we got that done. And then somebody came along and said, you people are training people for the tool trade, and that's good. But engineering is changing. There is flexible engineering. And that's what the Japanese has been doing for years. That's what the Germans have been doing for years. Why are you only doing this? You cannot compete in a global economy if your people are not trained to do that. So of course, we have no 5-year plan. You know, like most big places, they have 5-year plans and all this kind of elaborate stuff that we're going to do this in X number of years. We don't have any plan. We do what's necessary. And we decided that we ought to try to do this. Just about that time, several people, the automobile manufacturing companies began to lay off and cut back and all kinds of things, simply because they were changing manufacturing, and the people that they had in the plant, they didn't need all those people anymore, particularly if they had no skill for anything to do but push a button and let a machine down on a piece of metal and stamp it out. And it took 10 or 12 people to make a car. Well, you no longer need that. One person